Welcome to a Wonder Junkie podcast. I'm your host, Ryan Anderson.
Nobody knows what's going on. Nobody knows. Nobody has the faintest idea. The best guesses are lies. You may be sure of it.
Well, thank you for joining me today.
Yeah, glad to be here.
Absolutely. I've been finding your ideas fascinating and reading some of your work, and I've even heard you speak on a few podcasts, and I thought it would be really fun to explore consciousness together and hear more about how you got to thinking the way that you think. So here we are. I appreciate this.
Sure, happy to chat, yeah.
Yeah, what are you currently doing? Just give the audience, people that have probably never found your work or know who you are, just give them a little introduction of who you are and what you're doing currently, and then we can dig a little deeper.
Right, so I'm a philosopher who mainly specializes in philosophy of mind, consciousness, and ethics. And last year I published this book on the weirdness of the world, which is all about metaphysics and consciousness and cosmology. And right now I'm working on two books on AI. One on whether AI might soon be conscious, and how would we know, and how do we deal with the fact that scientists are very likely to disagree about this. And the other one on the ethical implications if we create AI who either are conscious or who we think might be conscious, but we don't know.
That's awesome. Yeah, that's going to be fascinating. I'm sure it's a lot to chew on when you start to dive into AI. There's so many directions.
It's super hot these days. I mean, ChatGPT just changed the whole landscape of people's thinking about AI.
Yeah, absolutely. And then I had Michael Levin on. I don't know if you've heard of him, but he does some cool stuff with synthetic biology, and he uses AI with a team of people. And there's so much cool stuff happening that it's hard to keep track of all of it, nor should you even try. You'd be overwhelmed. It's like a buffet where you just keep eating. It's like, all right, take some time to digest. That's what I have to do with podcasts and information this day and age.
It's impossible to keep up, yeah.
It's impossible. Well, to write books, that takes a ton of attention. And I'd love to get into your thoughts around attention and awareness, because as you've studied philosophy, it seems like for many years, where did that trajectory start for you, like early on? And then we can get into placing attention on wanting to write books and what the underlying reason is to even write something and to put all of your attention into managing that, because that's a lot of energy.
So how did I get into philosophy in particular?
Yeah, like what sparked that curiosity early on?
I have always been interested in many things, very divided attention academically.
Mm-hmm.
When I was an undergraduate, I just took whatever classes I felt like with no attention to prerequisites or whether it would add up to a major or requirements or anything like that. And I found over the course of my education that I was closer to finishing a philosophy degree than anything else. And that was attractive, actually, also in part because one of the wonderful things about philosophy as an academic discipline is that you can basically study any X. And if you do it in a kind of deep enough way, then you're doing philosophy of X. So it's a discipline that is very welcoming to people who have broad interdisciplinary interests that range across many things like I do.
I love that. And when you were young, like a very young kid, were you pretty experimental, exploring life, or were you repressed with a certain ideology? I'm always curious where the upbringing begins.
I was raised in a pretty liberal exploratory household. My father was a psychologist who was a soft money researcher at Harvard when I was born, and he actually invented the location monitoring device that people now wear as an ankle monitor as an alternative to being incarcerated.
Wow.
He invited that because he specialized in juvenile delinquency, and he thought prison was a terrible place for children to be, and he wanted there to be a way for them to be monitored, but not in prison, right? If the alternative is prison, right, it's better for them to be free but monitored. So he invented it with that kind of idea of helping people be free. And he actually had this wonderful clinical methodology for dealing with these, as we called them at the time, juvenile delinquents, where he just paid them to come in and talk into a tape recorder 1 or 2 or 3 times a week about anything they wanted.
Huh.
And sometimes he didn't even ask questions. He just left the tape recorder on, and they're in the room for an hour just talking. Right? And he
Fascinating.
found that it reduced rates of recidivism just to have people because inevitably, if you have an hour, you're going to start talking about what you care about and how you see your future and what do you really want out of life. I mean, you can't just talk for an hour without getting into those issues, I think.
So it became pretty medicinal.
So just by, and this is fascinating to me, just by inviting people, ordinary boys, to reflect freely, he found that they kind of discovered their values and found better paths through life. So that's really interesting. So he and my mother also were just very freedom encouraging parents.
That's amazing. And then I did read somewhere that your dad was friends with, or at least worked with, Timothy Leary. Is that true?
Oh yeah. Timothy Leary was one of his supervisors. Yeah. So he was involved with some of the famous LSD experiments. Yeah.
Like he partook in that, or he was also helping to
he was one
administer?
of the collaborators. Yeah. Administer and co-author on some of the work. Yeah.
Wow. I wonder, it would be cool. Is he still alive today?
No, he died 10 years ago.
Oh,
yeah.
Okay. Not to get all side real. I was like, maybe it'd be cool to have your dad on. No, he just sounds like an interesting guy for sure.
He was very interesting. Yeah. My mother was also, is also, she's still alive, very interesting. She was, she's a math and science teacher in community college, and was a trailblazer in science teaching and administration, in her generation, when a lot of women weren't doing that kind of stuff.
And what does she think of your books and your writing and your style, the weirdness of life and the philosophy of jerks, things like that?
She's proud of me. She brags about me. Yeah.
Yeah, that's cool. Well, the weirdness of life, that's pretty much what draws me to do this podcast. It's called A Wonder Junkie, and it's all about inspiring curiosity and wonder. I think it's life force energy for people. And I think if people become curious about anything, you could be curious about your own cognition or just the nature of consciousness. You can start anywhere, and you almost can never again conceive of being bored. And like, I don't believe in that word. I think it's a lack of attention or something,
I always tell my kids bored means tired.
It's a good correlation.
Because the world is not boring.
Right.
And when they're energetic, they'll find the fascinating things, unless they're being, really constrained in some way, right? I mean, if you're strapped down in a chair, you have to have a pretty special kind of mind not to find that boring after a certain amount of time. But if you're at loose in the world with all of the resources we have around us, the only condition under which I think I won't want to say all people, but most people would actually be bored is if they don't have the energy to see the interest in the things around them.
Yeah. And then the piece now with technology moving so fast and there's an attention economy, children are dealing with something that we can get into free will or agency, but like at what point is attention management more capable of it? Like we can cultivate it a little bit through awareness and removing ourselves. And I think we almost need that more than ever now to even know that you are somewhat being raped for your attention online through dopamine hits.
Yeah, it is. I notice in myself that it is harder than it was 15 or 20 years ago for me to just sit and read a book for a long period of time without something in my mind wanting to check some social media thing or something like that. So yeah, even us old guys, it hits, right? So I think we do have to be very cognizant of that. And some of it's wonderful because, it's great. I think, if you cultivate your social media feeds, and then there's lots of amazing, wonderful stuff on there. It's not, I guess I don't like the word raped there. I think you're invited. You're invited, and it's enticing, and it's good, and it's because in many ways that it's good that it's so enticing. But it can get out of control.
Yeah. I guess I use that word because of seeing The Social Dilemma and seeing Tristan Harris's work. And they break down these people that help create and engineer these systems. They make it to where it's almost impossible for a young person. Like heroin, it's super addictive, and sugars like that and things like this. When you give it to a young person before they really have a fully developed brain, it has a whole different set of consequences versus you and I who grew up without it. And it's so much easier, even though it's still hard. So we get to select for versus if you just get an iPad shoved in your face at the age of 6, it does destroy dopamine tracks and it starts to ruin the biochemistry of the brain to some degree. And you're almost pre-addicting. And I'm not trying to get all doom and gloom, but I am seeing this as one of the biggest features of the issue here, because it is so beautiful that I can talk to you and I talk to other scientists and thinkers around the world and learn while I'm doing laundry. But then it's like, okay, at what point is this also for the young generation being born into it? Is it dangerous to some degree?
Yeah, I'm not an expert on that research, but I've attuned enough to realize that there is some pretty good research suggesting it has some pretty negative consequences on young people, maybe especially girls. Yeah.
Nice. Yeah. So when you're writing about AI right now, what are some of the things that you're seeing as you're writing and thinking about it in the next 5 or 10 years?
Well, the biggest thing that I've been thinking about and worrying about is the question of whether some of our AI systems might be conscious in that time frame. In the sense that they have experiences. There's something it's like to be them. They can feel real positive or negative emotions or feelings or something like that, right? What I think is likely to happen is that we will create some systems that, according to some respectable mainstream scientific theories, really do have experiences, really are conscious, really can suffer and feel joy, right? While at the same time, according to other equally mainstream respectable scientific theories, these things will be basically just complex toasters, not capable of any meaningful kind of experience. And so we'll have, I think, a scientific dispute. I think this is coming down in probably 5 to 10 years is about, I'm guessing about the right time frame. There's going to be a scientific dispute and won't really have the means to resolve that dispute. And different members of society will have stakes in siding with one side or another, right? So people who are really attached to AI companions might be motivated to like the science that says their companion really has feelings, and really is in love with them, right? And then other people will be highly motivated to want to deny that, right? Especially from religious traditions. You might say, well, they got no souls, right? So I think there's going to be a pretty big scientific and maybe also social, I don't know if crisis is the right word, but maybe crisis, at least conflict and choice point that's going to arise. So that's where a lot of my energy has been going in thinking over the last year or two since I finished The Weirdness of the World and have been shifting into this other project on AI.
Oh, it's fascinating. And then I've heard you speak to and write a little bit about moral psychology and some of the issues inside of that subject of morals and ethics and how people have these discussions, but it doesn't always equal out to how they actually behave on the individual level. So that's like, so who are the people that are going to be programming these machines? And are you just more of a spectator in awe and wonder, or are you trying to drive it in a certain direction? Or what's your stake as far as influencing the future? Because if you're writing about it, there's influence there.
Yeah. Well, you're referring to my series of articles on the moral behavior of ethics professors. Right? And I found over and over again in a bunch of empirical studies that ethics professors don't behave any differently from other types of professors, right? Which is the kind of natural comparison point in terms of education level and salary and social status and stuff like that, right? So it doesn't look like studying ethics has any big impact on your behavior. And there's some pretty stunning results there that I'm happy to talk about, but don't connect directly to the AI stuff that we're talking about. We could go that direction if you want. But yeah, so this partly is grounded in and partly supports my distrust of academic ethical expertise. So I am not confident that the people who specialize in ethics in our society are going to be giving good advice about what to do in the kinds of
Hmm.
situations we might find ourselves. I mean, I think one way in which this is already manifesting, has been manifesting for a while, is there's a big literature on AI risk, AI safety, AI alignment, and that's a large part of AI ethics. And the whole idea, I think, of risk, safety, and alignment prioritizes, implicitly or maybe explicitly, human risk to humans, safety for us,
Hmm.
alignment with us. And all of that makes invisible, or at least deprioritizes, the value that the AI might have in its own right, and the freedom and respect it might deserve in its own right, if it really is conscious, capable of feeling, capable of making autonomous decisions.
Yeah.
Right. So part of what I want to do is I'm disinclined to think I've got the right answers to these things, but part of what I want to do is challenge a little bit that framing that we see so much in AI ethics.
Mm. And what did you see when you started to point out some of the cross-cultural differences when it comes to moral behavior and ethics? And you start to see that if you're in one culture, people believe that a certain thing, a certain set of behaviors is fine versus another culture. And that's some of the underlying issues with even having that discussion on the front end, right? It's cultural infusion. It's so much induced by how you were raised and what's normal where you're from.
Yeah. Um, I was reading a book um, on this called, I'm going to forget the title, but it's by Keen, an anthropologist named Keen. And I think it's called Animals, Robots, and Gods. And it's a fascinating exploration of the cultural differences in how we think about gods, right? And of course, in English speaking West, when we think of gods, we typically think of a monotheistic, all powerful God, right? Of course, that's not super common globally across cultures. So they're very different ways of thinking about gods, and the ways that we think about AI might not be so different from how we think about gods. And one of Keen's points is that kind of deep in our inheritance, culturally and maybe evolutionarily, is an inclination to think in these ways that get manifested as a kind of God worship, and that might transfer right over
Mm.
to AI systems, right? But another thing also, there's a lot of difference among cultures in how they treat animals, right? And that's also deep in our culture and in our evolutionary history. And AI has some resemblance to animals too, right? So some of those
Mm.
cultural practices may transfer over to AI, and the way that different cultures do it might look pretty different.
Yeah, that's very fascinating. What is your thought on the transhumanist movement? There's a lot of people pushing this idea. I'm sure you're very familiar with. Is it another religion of a sort? It's obviously some form of belief system or orientation with technology, but
Yeah, right. Well, so kind of following up on Keen's idea, right? It does seem like in some of its manifestations, transhumanism picks up on the kind of cultural practices and human endowment that gets manifested in religion. Whether to call it religious, I don't know whether you want to say that exactly. It depends on what you mean by religion.
mm,
But if you're thinking in terms of like an eschatology, right, like an endpoint of things, or kind of a set of ideals, a movement of people who kind of agree with each other about foundational issues and want to move the culture in certain directions, it's got some resemblance. Um, so I I have a mixed reaction to transhumanism in general. I feel like reactions to it tend to be very bipolar, and I don't find myself quite on either of those poles, right? So there are people who think, well, obviously
mm,
we should make ourselves better, And obviously it'd be good if human beings didn't die, in less than 100 years typically, and if we could enhance our capacities. And they think it's kind of almost ridiculous not to be a transhumanist. And then there are people I think are just viscerally repulsed by the whole thing, or who see such strong historical echoes with eugenics and authoritarianism. And I guess I'm kind of in the middle. I mean, I'm sympathetic with the people who have a lot of concerns about how eugenics plays out and potential authoritarian worries and the inequality that would be likely to arise if some people have access to enhancements and others don't. At the same time, I don't have quite the same, I think, broad-based, visceral, just like, of course it's, reject the whole thing. I think there's something wonderful and there's something potentially amazingly wonderful about a transformed world that's populated with our descendants who might be very different from us and wonderful in all kinds of ways that we could only partly foresee.
Yeah. No, I feel like we could be compared to already being transhuman just by looking at what we're doing right in this moment compared to 200 years ago. If we were to show a snapshot of us talking through space-time and a screen and being able to blast it out to random bots on the planet, and all, people would be like, that's like an exoskeletal telepathy type version of the human consciousness, and that's an upgrade. But
right,
yeah,
there's this famous quip by Arthur C. Clarke about any technology sufficiently advanced will seem like magic, right? So to someone from 300 years ago, the fact that we're having this conversation across space and time is like, a magic spell cast by a wizard, right?
Yeah.
So you might think, okay, in a sense, we're already transhuman. I'm a little nervous about people who use transhuman a little too broad, so broadly as that, because I think there's a more specific sense of it that's more radical that I think we don't want to blur too much with our current condition.
Yeah, I do feel like that's what's happening, is that the true transhumanists, if you want to call them that, they try to broaden it out in that way to sweep more people in, almost like a a cult. I'll be honest, but whatever.
It seems less threatening. It seems less threatening if you say, "Oh, well, by transhumanism, I just mean getting past X, and X is kind of limited." And you say, "Well, yeah, of course we should get past X, right?" But
sure, where does it end? Yeah.
Right.
I've had some theories lately about when people bring up, they throw it around very, very easily. I think you always hear about simulation theory now. Oh, is this a simulation? And I just feel like it's somewhat of a really limited model based on the things that we've created. I feel like it doesn't solve any problems. It just brings us back to point zero of like, what is life and what is consciousness and what was the thing that created the simulation. But my problem with it is when people subscribe to it as a whole and like really double down and go, this is a simulation. To me, what it is a way to not be responsible for the way we orient in this life. It gets rid of all existential and moral reasoning, because you're like, oh, it's a simulation, do whatever you want. And it does have it would have an effect on the tech and on the way that you perform and live, and it would get rid of a lot of empathy in a way.
Yeah, that's interesting. I can see it going that way. That's not what I see in professional philosophers who take the simulation hypothesis seriously. Especially people like Nick Bostrom and David Chalmers, right? They don't draw that conclusion. They don't say, oh, it might be a sim, therefore, woo, everything's allowed, right? It's all fake, right? Chalmers in particular is very emphatic that, things that happen in a simulation are real, and a simulated world is approximately as valuable as a base level world. And Bostrom is very concerned about existential threats to us, right? Not like, oh, it's a sim, so do whatever you want. So so I think that, and also I guess I'd say most of the philosophers who are interested in simulation theory don't conclude that we're probably in a simulation, just that we can't know that we're not, and there's a reasonable chance. Bostrom puts it at about 1/3. Chalmers puts it at about 1 in 4. I put it at about 1 in 100 that we're in a simulation of some sort. Right?
And if we were or weren't, what does that mean?
Well, here I guess I'm inclined to diverge from Chalmers and Bostrom, right? So I think Chalmers and Bostrom both want to downplay the implications of it and say, hey, look, if we're in a sim, it's still our world, right? There's still mountains to climb. There's still personal relationships you're in. It's just like fundamental reality is just a little different than you thought. But nothing really needs to shift in your behavior. Whereas I'm inclined to think that if we are in a simulation, we don't have particularly good reason to assume that it's a large, stable simulation. It could just be you and me having a conversation. It could have been created 100 years ago or 1 year ago, right? It might contain only Earth. It might contain only one city, right? I mean, most of the simulations we create are pretty limited in their temporal scope and their geographical scope. So if we're in a simulation, I think, although I don't think it's very likely, I give it about a 1% to 0.1% chance. Right? If we're in a simulation, then I think there's a reasonable chance that it's a short-term one. And then the implications of that would be that maybe you should deprioritize long-term goods. Like, there's a 50% chance that the world won't exist tomorrow, then that's less reason to save for retirement. Now, I guess, like Bostrom and Chalmers, but in a different way, I don't think a whole lot of import follows from this, because I think the chance that we're in a simulation is small. But if I were to think it was large, then it would have a pretty big effect on me. I would think that long-term goods would be rationally deprioritized.
That makes more sense, but I could see that the average person that's not a philosopher or has any good first principles thinking, if they subscribe any belief system, let's get into belief system versus truth.
Yeah.
And what the difference is. Not that we have an overarching truth. Nobody knows. I love the unknown and the uncertainty as my double down on, because it seems to be the most certain thing, is that nobody has a clue. And that I've had some crazy experts on here, and then I just love learning from everyone that's like deeply invested in these fields of cognition and consciousness and physics. And at the end of the day, they all come back with a lot of arguments, and we still have a good understanding of physics. But when it comes to even biology, like, and how it's, in relationship to every influence that we tamper with, it's so complex that we don't know much about anything, Right.
I mean, and they say, we know physics very well, except for the large and the small and the fast and the fluid.
Yeah.
And the dark. In other words, most of it.
Yeah. So belief systems, I've seen that usually they don't work out for mostly positive. I mean, I could see a lot of people, it feels nice to be able to move forward and to get things done. But if you look at the zoom out on history, it seems that it's driven us into the most amount of war and ideology. And some of the worst things have come from just believing our own BS.
Yeah. I mean, I agree with you about that. And one thing that you were saying at the beginning of the podcast about how much you like this kind of wonder and uncertainty and doubt and the kind of amazing, weird awesomeness of the universe. And I think I totally relate to that. And that really is kind of the spirit in which my 2024 book, The Weirdness of the World, is written. And, that's, I think, have very similar attitudes about that. So one of the ways that to kind of develop on your idea about dogmatism and overconfidence being a source of strife and and harm in the world. I mean, of course, we've seen this with religious wars and all kinds of things. I much prefer the freedom. One of the ways to kind of lean into that in a more positive direction is to think about what I think of as some of the great humane skeptics in the history of philosophy. And my two favorite are the ancient Chinese philosopher Zhuangzi and the early modern French philosopher Michel de Montaigne. And they're both so full of doubt and wonder about the universe, so full of skeptical arguments and self-critical thoughts and uncertainty, and at the same time just awed by the universe. And at the same time, along with this, I think if you read their works, you get this sense of this kind of humane tolerance of different perspectives and respect for people with different life experiences and different voices. And Zhuangzi has all of these stories. It's so out of tune with his time in a way. He has all these stories of people who are at the lowest rungs of society, like being their weird, wonderful selves and outsmarting the brilliant philosophers. And you just get this sense, I think, with both of them, of this very main voice. So the kind of the complement of this negative thought about the destructive power of overconfident dogmatism is, I think, the positive thought about the humanizing power of appreciating the diversity of perspectives and holding your own positions kind of with doubt and lightness.
I love that. I think that would be the ultimate gift to humanity, is just more perceptual humility, the ability for us to truly be okay with uncertainty and lean into the weirdness, like you said, of life. Because at the end of the day, you have two options. You can cling to what you think you know and what you've been programmed with and conditioned to, or you can expand and learn and realize that the thing gets so much more interesting as we tamper and probe and seek, and even laying on your bed under a starry night, or you can do so many things that blow your own mind that it doesn't, I don't know, all it does is humble you. And I don't know if you've ever read like Robert Anton Wilson. Did you ever get into him? He
No, I
went by
don't know him.
Ra. He was hilarious. Okay. But at the end of the day, he would come back with an idea that you wake up every day. If you don't wake up at least once a month, I think he said, and feel like you're a cosmic schmuck, then then he goes, you're the ultimate cosmic schmuck, and he said something along the lines of, like, if you wake up and you think that you could never be a cosmic schmuck, then you're probably the ultimate cosmic schmuck, things like that. But he was amazing, and he would always bring humor into it. And a lot of my favorite people do that because they realize that there's nothing to even take too seriously if you don't even know much about it,
Right. And Zhuangzi and Montaigne are both funny.
I could imagine.
The humor is good too.
That's what I was thinking. I'll be reading their work when we're done.
Yeah. Let me kind of just develop this idea a little bit more with a contrast that I draw in the opening chapter of The Weirdness of the World between what I call the philosophy of closing and the philosophy of opening.
Awesome.
So you could enter a debate or an issue thinking that there are three possible truths, right? So how does the mind relate to the world, for example? You might think, well, one possibility is it's all material. Another possibility is that there's an immaterial soul and a material body, right? Or maybe those are the only two possibilities that seem viable to you at the moment, right? You can enter a debate with kind of two or three possibilities in mind, and then the philosophy of closing says, okay, let's figure out which one's right. You come up with an argument, you say, okay, yes, my ideal is to figure out, okay, this one's right and that one's wrong, right? So then you've closed your two or three possibilities down to one, right? Philosophy of opening says, you think there's only two possibilities? Here's one you hadn't thought of, right? Here's another you hadn't thought of. And instead of settling down on one, it expands your sense of the possible. Some possibilities you maybe had not even thought of as a possibility before, or some possibilities you'd thought of, but you dismissed as, that's ridiculous, right? And I think we can learn philosophically by adding possibilities just as much as we can learn by closing. And one of the things that we learn is that the world is kind of weirder and has more depth and interest than we'd originally thought. Right. So that's part of the spirit in which I offer, for example, the simulation hypothesis. It's not that I'm, a gung-ho simulation theorist or anything like that. It's that what I want to do is I think a lot of people don't take it seriously at all. And I'm not inclined to think that it's super likely, but I do think that it's likely enough that we can't close it off. And if you're one of those people who either hasn't thought of it or who thought of it but think, that's ridiculous, then what I want to do is, and what I do in the relevant chapter of the book that talks about this is give you enough support for it and show you enough of the appeal of it that you can say, yeah, I guess I can't rule that out. I guess that is a live possibility.
Yeah, I like that. And what do you, if you had a belief system or an orientation, what do you think this thing is that we're a part of?
What do I think the cosmos is that we're a part of?
Yeah, like life, consciousness. What is this thing? What are you leaning towards at this point when you wake up in the morning? Your existential relationship to the experience.
I think the world is intractably and perhaps infinitely complex, and will always defy our ability to put it in a tidy box and come up with the equation and the philosophy and the words that capture it fully. And what I want to do is celebrate the wonderful weirdness of it and appreciate that and nurture that. I think of this as a kind of a Taoist perspective. So Zhuangzi, the ancient Chinese philosopher I mentioned, is one of the first Taoists. He's not quite as well known, especially in the West, as Lao Tzu, who's the hypothetical notional author of the Tao Te Ching. But kind of the two canonical ancient Taoist texts are the Tao Te Ching and the text of the Zhuangzi. And I think what I really like, and especially Zhuangzi's version of the Taoist perspective, is this kind of sense of the world as a cycle of amazing, wonderful, weird patterns that don't fully make sense to us, but we can ride with them, flow with them, encourage the good, step away from the bad, and help this world become even more awesome and amazing and complex and rich with diversity. So that's kind of, I don't know, the axiology and cosmology that I broadly lean toward.
I really like that a lot, actually. It's cool because it becomes practical in nature. And I think at the end of the day, that's what we would really want from any form of just existential, when you're overwhelmed with too much awe, if you're to read the Tao or if you're to have a metaphysical or some sort of spiritual experience, that's beautiful and it can be enlightening or whatever you want to call it. But then at the end of the day, it's like, all right, now the laundry. I think it was like Jack Cornfield goes, first the ecstasy, now the laundry. I'm like, yeah, how do you deal with the everyday bullshit too,
Yeah.
So
yeah, I'm definitely not an ideal practitioner of this worldview or Taoist practice or anything like that. But
yeah,
but it's something that I find attractive and inspiring.
Is there some cool books on the Tao that would be digestible to an average reader out there, do you think, or a good starting point?
A lot of people like the Tao of Pooh.
Okay.
Have you heard of it?
No.
Oh, well, maybe your readers would like that.
The Tao of Pooh?
Yeah, like Winnie the Pooh.
That's what I was thinking. Okay, cool.
Yeah, it's kind of portrays Winnie the Pooh as kind of a imperfect Taoist.
Nice.
It's charming.
Awesome. I'll have to look that one up when we get down, and I'll make sure I put it in the show notes for people. There's a lot of things I wanted to ask you about, like telepathy and things like this. I'm sure your dad was one of the early people to discover this, because I know that the school he was at with Timothy Leary and all these guys, that was when they were really getting fascinated with psychology. And we started Operation Paperclip, and I've always been fascinated with social engineering and all the fun stuff. But at the end of the day, I am fascinated when I hear these people that do remote viewing. And what do you think of this stuff? These experiences that people talk about?
Well, I don't entirely dismiss them, but I am inclined to think that's not real.
Okay.
I am a little bit more of a standard issue scientific materialist
Yeah.
than kind of believer in psi or paranormal or whatever you want to call it phenomena. But I'm not a dogmatic adherent to kind of mainstream scientific realism, so I'm open to that. One thing that's kind of disappointed me a little bit, and my uncle, I should say, my father's twin, was also a psychology professor and was a big believer in telekinesis, especially spoon bending kind of stuff. I don't know if you've heard of that, right?
Mm-hmm.
And one of the things that I find kind of has led me away from believing him on that is, the video evidence is not so good, right? And back in the early 80s, you could kind of forgive the people for having pretty weak video evidence. And I saw some blurry videos of this kind of stuff. And,
Yeah.
But now everybody's got video cameras in their pockets, and it's still so hard to see kind of credible scientific video evidence of the paranormal phenomena. So that's part of the thing that has reduced my credence in psi phenomena since the 80s, when I was more open to it.
Yeah. Well, that's interesting. What about the consciousness being more focused on the brain? Like a lot of neuroscientists, we call it neuromania, or somebody termed that, where everybody's super focused on the brain, and then other people are more focused on the body. And some people are like, it's not either one,
Right. Yeah. One of the ways that I like to think about this is what I call the Copernican argument for alien consciousness. So, Copernican principle in cosmology is the idea that we kind of live in a low rent location, an average location in the universe, nothing particularly special or amazing like the exact center. So, I think you can apply this to the question of consciousness too. You can say, hey, look, there are like 1 trillion galaxies in the observable portion of the universe, right? And I say the observable portion advisedly. The universe itself might be infinite, right? So it is so likely, even if you accept something like the rare earth hypothesis, right? It is so likely that in some of these galaxies, maybe only 1 in a billion galaxies, right, some kind of life evolves or emerges that is socially complex, communicatively complex, technologically complex, like us. It would be amazing in an un-Copernican way if only we were conscious, and the others were like mere zombies with no experiences that kind of just move around like really complicated posters, whatever, right? But at the same time, it's almost inevitable that they'll be physiologically different from us. I mean, if the environment's at all different, it's probably they're not gonna have exactly the same kinds of neurons and brains that we do, and maybe architectures could be very different, right? For example, if life evolves in an ammonium liquid substrate instead of water or something like that, or even if life has to be carbon, why would it have to be carbon like us, right? So probably, kind of from this Copernican cosmological perspective, there's radically different, complex social, technological life out there that's probably just as conscious as we are. And that way of thinking, I think, helps us deprioritize thinking of like the specifics of our brain as being so important. The brain's great. I think, everybody who's scientifically oriented as I am, right, thinks the brain is super central to our capacities. But if you had some other system that generated the same kinds of complex behavioral capacities, might look very different from the brain. It's still going to have all the same awesome specialness that we have, in virtue
Yeah.
of being, having the biologies we have.
Yeah. I love that. Have you ever read Ernest Becker's work, The Denial of Death?
I've heard of it, but I haven't read it.
Yeah, I didn't know if you'd come across it. It's fascinating, and it basically speaks to an idea that death and our awareness of death as human beings is so unique to our species, and that's what's driving all of the creativity and the art and the beautiful things, but it's also driving
Yeah.
all the negative. But do you think that awareness piece of us being human, because we are the weirdest thing that we can study, I think, on this planet, from what I gather.
I'm inclined to agree.
Yeah, do you think it's death that drives that? Because we don't know what's going to happen when we're gone?
I've got two reactions to that. One is, now without having read the stuff, but your summary matches the secondhand understanding I have from other sources, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's one of these kind of reductive type of accounts that doesn't fit my instincts toward messiness and multi-causality and against these kind of clean theories.
Yeah.
Right. So there's that kind of meta level thing.
Mm-hmm.
And then kind of even setting aside that meta level thing, I don't think we think about death that much. I think there's so many things that move us. If my inclination would be, if I was going to guess on one reductive thing, but I'm opposed to reductive things in general, but probably more central would be something like social approval. Right? We care so much what other people think of us, and that drives so much of what we do.
Yeah.
So I would put that
agree.
above death in terms of common motivator.
It's almost that we don't think of death enough. And that subconscious knowing that we're going to die, and we see our parents die and all this, to some degree is the issue. Not an issue, but it's not like this is the final answer or reductionist. But I always think maybe we should, I like to meditate on my death quite often in a fun way, because it makes you really appreciate life. The finiteness of it is what, to me, makes life more meaningful.
Yeah. I think it can be helpful to think about your mortality and the fact that you only have limited years and days and minutes on this earth. Remind yourself of that as you're scrolling through TikTok or whatever.
Yeah.
Does our brevity, is that somehow essential to having meaning? Philosophers have been arguing about this a lot recently, right? And this reaches back to the stuff we're talking about with transhumanism, because one of the standard objections in philosophy to transhumanism is that, well, if a transhumanism means that we could live for 1,000,000 years, then the urgency of things would be gone, and life would be robbed of meaning. And I feel a little bit of the pull of that, but I'm not completely compelled by that. I mean, I think we could find meaning even in a very long life, even if there wasn't a prospect of imminent death. There'd be so many other things one could do.
Yeah, I like that too. As long as your biology didn't have to suffer along through it. If we can get that part figured out. It's more of the suffering I think people are concerned with, the physical deterioration of the physiology. But
well, yeah, death is both things, really. Mm-hmm. In some sense, we're always dying. I mean, the person I was 15 years ago is no longer with us.
Yeah.
And as I see, especially, the older people in my extended family losing their cognitive capacities and losing their physical capacities, right? It's like, in a sense, they are no longer who they were.
Yeah, there's an element to the exploration of consciousness that I come from being a fireman for 20 years and seeing all kinds of suffering like right away in your face. It's like, all right, simulation theory is not going to cut this one unless you want to bypass it completely. Stoicism doesn't fully hold up under pressure. You get under certain things, but you go, okay, how do I relate to my experience, which I think we can create meaning with our narratives. And that's one of the most important things, but not BSing ourselves, not subscribing to bullshit, but at the
Yeah.
same time, trying to find the truth about the nature of suffering, which I've always been truly fascinated with because I've seen the overdoses, the suicides, the kid
Mhm.
getting hit by the car, all the things.
Yeah.
And so I've been lucky to have the nervous system and the brain and the time off and all of the luxuries that have allowed me to find my way through that and feel good about it and still do it. But to people who maybe are too busy, they're raising kids, they don't have time to go sit on a hilltop and do breath work and catch a sunset and all the things that help maybe manage that. What do you think about this, the nature of suffering, and maybe a philosophy that would help people relate to the nature of the world in a way that's healthy?
Yeah, that's a big one. I haven't figured out suffering very well. I don't like
It's a
it.
big one.
I
Right.
have not had the severe kind of suffering that many people have had, but my limited exposure to suffering is I'm generally think I don't like it. On the other hand, a world without any suffering would be so hard to imagine and so different from our experience. As part of the complexity and value of the world, that there is loss, and I think that's one of the things that the Taoists recognize, right? That by seeing things in terms of patterns that come and go, instead of in terms of objects and people that endure, right? It already builds in the going and the death into the picture of being. And you see Bangsa, for example, does not have the same kind of negative attitude toward death that I have.
Hmm.
So, but there was something in your remark that also I would have some hesitation about, and connects back a little bit to what I was saying about my mistrust of ethical expertise and philosophical expertise. I'm not sure having the time to meditate on the hill is that helpful. Right? When I think about who is wise, who is ethical, who handles life well, it, in my mind, doesn't correlate super well with the people who have the luxury of plenty of time to read Taoist treatises and engage in meditative practices, right? People who are in situations that are very demanding, where they don't have the luxury of reading a lot of philosophy books or engaging in these kinds of practices, they're often wiser and more centered and more grounded than the blissed out meditator.
Yeah. And the therapy, like we have a therapy culture, and they're starting to show that the more therapy you go to, the worse off you end up being, rumination.
Yeah. I don't want to say all of that is bunk, because I don't think it's all bunk, but I think the relationship is much more complex, and it's yeah, I want to be cautious about kind of assuming that it's necessary or even helpful consistently for people to those kinds of things, as opposed to be engaged in the lives and world that they find themselves in,
What were some
hopefully
of the
a
things?
thoughtful, loving way.
Yeah, you've discovered a lot about the moral and ethical people that study these things, and you've come back with a few examples. Can you give a few of the big ones that help people to see through some of that stuff that we might think would come out a different way?
One of the more striking examples in my work on ethics professors concerns vegetarianism. So this is based on a study I did in 2009. Well, that's when the survey was run. The study wasn't fully completed and published until 2014. But I asked professional philosophers who studied ethics. There are three groups of participants: professional philosophers in the U.S. who study ethics, professional philosophers who aren't ethicists, and a comparison group of professors in other departments at the same university. And I sent questionnaires to all three of these groups, and I got very high response rates, 60% response rates to my questionnaires, which is just kind of amazing by social science standards, and I don't think could be replicated anymore. It was just as kind of excitement about experimental philosophy was getting off the ground. So anyway, so I sent out these questionnaires, and I asked a bunch of questions where I had people describe their ethical attitudes about various issues, and then self-report their own behavior on those same issues. And then also for some of the issues, I had direct observational evidence about their own behavior. So one of the sets of questions, I didn't have direct observational evidence on this one, but one of the sets of questions concerned eating meat. So I asked in the first part of the questionnaire for participants to rate on a scale from 1 to 9, regularly eating the meat of mammals such as beef or pork. And 1 was very morally bad, 5 was morally neutral, 9 was very morally good. And what I found was the majority of ethics professor respondents, 60%, rated it somewhere on the bad side of the scale. For non-ethicist philosophers, it was 45%. And for professors from other departments, it was 19%. There's a pretty big difference in opinion about the ethics of eating meat. In the second part of the questionnaire, so this was done collaboratively, I should say, with Josh Rust, a philosophy professor at Stetson University. So in the second part of the questionnaire, we asked a couple questions about meat eating one, but the target one was, at your last evening meal, not including snacks, did you eat the meat of a mammal, such as beef or pork? And there we found no statistically detectable difference among the participants. So there's a pretty big difference in moral opinion, but they were eating meat at the same rate as the other participants. And we saw the same thing happen with gender and age, right? So and the results kind of stacked up, right? So women were more likely to say it was bad, and people born before 1960 were people born 1960 or later were more likely to say it's bad. So if you looked at female philosophers born 1960 or later, 80% said it was bad. If you look at male non-philosophers born before 1960, it was like 9%.
Wow.
Right? Think about, like, when have you ever seen a poll, an opinion survey, where you got a split of 80% versus 9%?
Right.
Just based on a couple of demographic factors. I mean, that's as big an opinion split as you could ever get.
Right.
But their rates of having even self-report, they could lie, right? You know, they could exaggerate, right? But even their self-reported rates of eating meat were not detectably different. But, you know, we had, once you subdivide it, it gets a little statistically complex, but there's little difference in the eating rates among these groups. So that's just one example that I found surprising about how philosophy professors moral conclusions, but then don't seem to act on them.
Mm-hmm. And there was way more examples, but is it because you went back to earlier, you said instead of people concerned with death, they're more concerned with what other people think. And so virtue signaling becomes the commodity of our culture or our time. Do you think that's what it is to sound and look ethical and moral and higher?
That's close, but I think it's not quite right. Because I don't think people actually want to look more ethical than their friends. My hypothesis, and I think, again, multi-causal, messy, right? So this is not meant to be a unifying hypothesis. And I don't think it explains even all of my own data, right? But central to my thinking about this is a hypothesis I call aiming for moral mediocrity. So I don't think people aim to be morally good by absolute standards. Most people. There are exceptions, right? But I don't think most people aim to be morally good or morally bad by absolute standards. They aim to be about as morally good as their peers.
Mm.
And I think they want to be perceived as morally good as their peers. You don't want to be seen as the one goody two-shoes. And you don't want to pay, most people don't want to pay the cost, right? If everybody else is cheating,
Yeah.
you don't want to be the one sucker who doesn't cheat and gets it. Like, so let's say you're in a class and 80% of the people in the class are cheating on the test and going to get A's.
Yeah.
Right. Most people are not going to want to say, I have integrity and I'll get an F, right? Right? Only a few. But most people will be like, look, if everybody else is getting away with it, me too. And they don't. And if their peers see them be the one with integrity and get an F, they're going to give them a hard time, right? This is called do-gooder derogation, right? So we have a tendency, and this hits vegetarians, right? Vegetarians often have the experience, which in a way seems kind of strange, of people disliking them for being vegetarian and criticizing them for being vegetarian, which, like, what skin is it off your nose?
Yeah.
Right? Well, the skin off your nose is that it makes you want to aim, or most people want to aim to be about as morally good as their peers. So as soon as see someone else going for higher standards, and that kind of means, oh, now maybe I have to go for those higher standards. I don't want to do that, right? So then you derogate the person who's morally better. You have to see something wrong with them, something bad with them, bring them down. So I don't think people actually want to be seen as morally great. They want to be seen as the same. They want to be seen, I think, actually even better. They want to be seen as B+. They want to be seen as a little better than average, but not exceptional in a way that's threatening to other people.
That's fascinating. I like that. Who are some of your favorite writers and even people on the planet today that are inspiring you in the fields of philosophy and science? Like, are there people alive right now that you're really looking at their work and loving it?
Well, David Chalmers is always wonderful. He is an analytic philosopher who works on consciousness mostly, but other things too, including, as we talked about, simulation theory and virtual reality. He is a philosopher's philosopher. He's very careful and rigorous, and he goes after big issues. I find him always very rewarding to read. I'm going to mention a dead person just because he's on my mind.
Yeah.
Even though you asked about living people. He hasn't come up yet. But he's been on my mind because I was just in Buenos Aires and I got to visit kind of a museum dedicated to him, and it's Jorge Luis Borges. And he's this Argentinian short story writer and poet who writes these fascinating, intellectually weird, mind-blowing stories. And one of the things I love about him, so we have this shared appreciation of the weirdness of the world, right, is you read Borges and you just come away, it's just so weird, and it just makes your picture of the world just flip around.
Cool.
He's got such fascinating stories. He's got one of my favorite stories of his is the Library of Babel. So he imagines a world that's a giant library, and in the library is every possible book. Where a book is just, most of the books turn out to be nonsense because you just take, 26 letters of the alphabet and some punctuation and randomly scramble them. You'll get a book, I guess, in a sense, right? So almost all of the books in this library are just random nonsense, right? So people are wandering around trying to find meaning in this infinite library of mostly meaningless books, and they find like a passage with meaning and they're just stunned. I mean, it's just like, it's such a weird fantasy picture of things. Where he has another story called Funes the Memorious, where he imagines someone who's got an absolutely perfect memory. And how it torments him, because anytime he tries to recall an event, he actually has to relive the event in its full detail, and it takes as long for him to remember it as the event actually took to transpire, right? And so just like this critique of, or exploration of, the necessary reductiveness of memory and how actually if you had a perfect memory, it would be terrible.
Yeah. Yeah, memory is a weird one, isn't it?
Yeah.
I always like to ponder it and think about how weird memory in itself is. And thank God we have it. But also, like you said, if we had a really crispy, clear memory, because people say I'm bad with names, I'm like, I'm grateful that I'm not remembering everybody's name. All it is an important file. And if I want to know a name like Daniel Schmachtenberg, I know that name because it's a package full of really cool ideas. And I want to send that, but
Yeah.
it's almost a feature that we don't have good memories in a way. So if you could give a recommendation for 5 books, only 5 books to a younger generation, say, that are coming up, what do you think they should read that would help them? Yeah.
All right. Well, we might as well start with Borges' collection of stories called Labyrinths. It's not all of his stories, but it's a wonderful collection translated into English of some of his most mind-bending stories. So I put Labyrinths on there. And maybe the Zhuangzi, we already mentioned the inner chapters, especially of the Zhuangzi, the first 7 chapters. I've also really been enjoying Ursula Le Guin recently. She's got this fascinating book called The Dispossessed, which imagines something like an anarchist utopia in a science fiction context, and kind of like it's not a perfect utopia. And it's a fascinating exploration of those ideas by, I think, one of the most insightful, interesting writers of the 20th century. Why don't we do Montaigne's essays, which I also mentioned, right? So the idea of essay actually traces back to Montaigne, right? So essay, its original Latin meaning is something like attempt.
Nice.
Right. And Montaigne, instead of writing a treatise, which means like, here are all the answers, instead what he wrote were like, here are my attempts. And he called them essays. Right. So these are short little reflections, often skeptical and self-critical and critical of his own culture and full of weird, interesting details and often going in completely unexpected directions. Right. So, and then from this, we get the idea eventually of the essay. Right, so Montaigne's essays, right? So that gives us 4. Let me throw in, since we've been talking about transhumanism and futurism, let me throw in Greg Egan's Diaspora. This is a book that came out in the 90s that imagines a technological future in which everybody lives in artificial realities, where there's not really where there's a lot of control over what you do and there's not a lot of need. So you're kind of living in a resourceful world of plenty as an artificial being. And one of the really interesting things about Egan's Diaspora is there's a bunch of characters who are all in their own different ways kind of struggling to figure out how do I live a life and find meaning in a world where I don't have to have a job and I don't need to do anything in particular to keep food on the table. Nothing is really being asked of me. So it's in a way the ultimate existential situation, right? It's like, okay, I've got basically complete freedom to change myself into whatever I want to be and do whatever I want to do. And so in those circumstances, what do you do? And his different characters come up with different kind of solutions to that problem. So it's an interesting kind of techno-utopian future with existential themes.
And does he write a lot of other books? Is he a philosopher? Or?
Oh, he's a science fiction writer. He's an important science fiction writer.
Cool.
Yeah.
Sounds
So
interesting.
this is in particular Diaspora and kind of slightly earlier novel called Permutation City are both kind of set in this reality. So those are the 2 that I recommend particularly for this. But he's written a whole bunch of short stories and novels.
Nice. And that's what you're going to be writing as fiction then, about the future of AI?
No, I'm a philosopher. I'm writing. So I guess it's funny that I'm not recommending philosophy books particularly.
No, that's awesome. I'm just curious how you write. Like, what's your future writing going to be like? So it's going to all just be philosophy,
I
but
do write some fiction. I published, I don't know, maybe 15-ish
little
science fiction
essays.
and fantasy type stories. So I do occasionally publish fiction, but most of it is expository philosophy
Cool.
writing. That seems to be what the world wants from me mostly.
Yeah. How do you write? What time of day? What does it look like? Do you have to shut everything out? What's your habit like?
Um, I love to write. Maybe it's the thing I love best to
Hmm.
do when it's going well. So, so I don't actually have a habit.
Yeah, you're just doing it.
I'm not one of these people who procrastinates writing. It's like I come to work and it's what I want. Well, I do one thing I do is I have a well-defined day. I come to work in the morning and I stay until 6-ish, right? So I
Mm.
work 9 to 6, and I'm in my office and I work the whole time. And then in the evenings and on weekends it's family time, or I do light reading of things that are fun for me, right? So, but when I'm here in my office, well, I want to write. And the thing that blocks me is I've got all these other obligations. I got to teach. I got to do email. I got to do, these other kinds of things. And
Mm.
so, as basically, I spend all the time that I have available to do it writing. Uh, so for me, I don't need to discipline myself to write. It's like I have
Awesome.
to discipline myself to do email.
Yeah. Yeah, you have to put all the parameters in place so you have free time to do the thing that you want to do all the time.
Yeah. So I come in and, if I can have the time, it's like, okay, now please, I've got these 3 things that I'm trying to do. Let's do them now.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Do you find inherent meaning in life, or do we create meaning? What do you think about meaning? Is there goal orientation, or what do you think about that?
Um, I think life has inherent meaning and we create the meaning.
What's the
Both.
inherent meaning?
Um, well, I guess I expressed it a little bit earlier in terms of my axiology, which is, kind of my sense of what has value in the world, right? Is that there's a kind of awesome flourishing of diverse forms and patterns in the world. And I think Earth in particular, of all the places in the galaxy that we know of, as far as we can tell, right, is an especially amazing place for having all kinds of diverse life. And especially, as you said, the humans, which are the
Mm-hmm.
weirdest of them all, right? They can do philosophy and achieve amazing athletic and artistic things and scientific things, and there's love and there's wars, and it's this amazing chaos of stuff, right? So the participating in and finding the good in and nurturing the good in that wild flow of diverse awesomeness is what I think constitutes being part of this meaningful world. And in the process, you are also creating your own, through your own choices, you're not just kind of like riding along with it, but adding to it and creating new meanings for it, choosing new things for yourself.
Beautiful. I love that answer. Well, I've had you for a while. If you were going to die today, this was your last day on Earth, and all you could do is speak one time to planet Earth, to the people out there, whoever gets so lucky to hear you speak, what would you want to share with them?
Oh, you didn't prep me for this, right? So you're
No.
springing all these questions like
Yeah,
my
serendipitous.
um wow, that feels like a lot of pressure. I'm not sure. Not sure what I would say. Maybe I mean, we've touched in this conversation on a lot of the main things that are really central to what I hope to achieve through being a philosopher and through being a person, which is to participate in, celebrate, enhance, help other people participate in and celebrate, enhance the wondrous, weird, diverse flourishing of forms of being in this world. Let's not all try to fit it into one form and one straitjacket and make it all seem normal and box it into a theory, but just appreciate how all the difference in the complexity and the wonderfulness of it all.
I love that. I really like the way you think. It's inspiring, and it helps people. I think anyone who's lucky enough to hear how you think or read your work, it's pretty cool. It only lights people up. So I appreciate you sharing some of your essence today.
Thanks for having me, and thanks for those kind words that you're concluding with.
Absolutely.
Thank you for listening to the episode. Be sure to subscribe to the show on Spotify, YouTube, and iTunes, and rate the show. I hope you enjoyed the episode.
What we call reality is in fact nothing more than a culturally sanctioned and linguistically reinforced hallucination.